In case you're new to the channel, I've made several videos about operative systems in the last couple of months, like Windows vs Linux on older AMD GPUs, or even Windows vs Linux on top tier cards from the past generation, like the RX 7900 XTX and the RTX 4080 Super, with some videos like Windows 10 vs Windows 11 as well, and those had some really interesting results, sometimes with Linux being faster than Windows. So today I am retesting Windows versus Linux, but now with new generation cards, in this case the RX 9070 XT and the RTX 5080. And at the same time, I am also testing one of the so long-awaited features from Linux that was supposed to come to Linux way sooner, which is NTSync. Some kind of new synchronization technology that is supposed to reduce the latencies and increase FPS. We'll see. And the process here was a clean installation of both operative systems, and both were kind of ran out of the box, so with out of the box performance. And by the way, if you want to know, I always disable virtualization on BIOS. And to make Linux work like you see on this video, all I had to do was to install Nobara 42, which is as simple as installing Windows nowadays, enter my Steam account, set the compatibility mode on Steam, which automatically downloads some Proton versions. Proton is kind of a translation layer from Valve, and then download the latest version of Proton GE from the Proton Plus app that also comes pre-installed, since Proton GE runs better than the normal Proton implementation in some games. And that was all. Every game that I tested was running out of the box, and the only games that didn't work were those ones that have pretty annoying anti-cheat systems or anti-cheat engines, and they just don't work because of that. So the game itself works, but they just don't work because the anti-cheat system doesn't work on Linux. And if you want to play games outside of Steam, it is also simple. Nobara 42 brings a software called Lutris that allows you to play games from GOG, Epic Store, Ubisoft Connect, and EA app. And you also have other alternatives like the Heroic Launcher, which I personally use even on Windows, that allows you to play all your games from GOG, Epic Store, and Amazon Prime. And of course it is also more user-friendly. Like today's sponsor. Today's video sponsor is GVG Mall, bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. And as I stated in my previous videos, I know that people that used Linux like 10 years ago will think this is odd, but Linux nowadays is just easy to use. The AMD drivers are built into the kernel, meaning that you don't really need to install absolutely anything to make it perform the best it can, and the NVIDIA drivers are still proprietary, but now with open modules, meaning that they will only get better with time. All these drivers are accessible through Nobara's driver manager, by the way, the same way that you can get the latest AMD drivers for your GPU. And now that you know how I made things work, let's see some results. Starting with The Witcher 3 at 1080p, we are most likely getting bottlenecked by the Ryzen 7 9700X with both GPUs, but we can already see small differences, where the 9070 XT is slightly faster on Linux, while the 5080 is a bit slower. Even though things are looking much better for the NVIDIA cards on Linux, it seems. Raising the resolution to 1440p ultra-wide though makes things change, with the 5080 being 17% faster than the 9070 XT on Windows, but only slightly faster on Linux, and with much lower 1% lows. Linux now loses performance even on the 9070 XT, but still performs quite well. And the same applies when we enable ray tracing and upscaling. At 1080p we have the 9070 XT barely losing performance when switching to Linux, even getting higher 1% lows, while the 5080 gets around the same performance as the 9070 XT on Windows of course, but falls short in terms of Linux performance. That does change at 1440p ultra-wide though, where the 5080 is able to show its true power, now being 17% faster than the 9070 XT on Windows and 20% faster on Linux. Moving to Counter-Strike 2, we don't really have results for F-Sync and NTSync, as Counter-Strike 2 runs natively with Vulkan on Linux, so those aren't used. At 1080p we have interesting results, with the 9070 XT performing better on Windows, maybe due to the lower CPU overhead when compared to the 5080, but somehow slower on Linux, which is kind of odd. When we move to 1440p ultra-wide and we get more graphically intense, well, we can see that both cards deliver lower FPS on Linux, but the 9070 XT, well, is being the card that is losing more performance, delivering only 86% of the performance on Linux, while the 5080 delivers 91%. Plague Tale Requiem has again F-Sync and NTSync results, as the game uses Proton, and at 1080p we have the 9070 XT being slower than the 5080 on Windows, but faster on Linux. Actually, even faster than the 5080 was on Windows. And at 1440p ultra-wide, we can say that the 9070 XT barely loses performance on Linux, as it delivers slightly lower average FPS, but quite higher 1% lows. And as for the 5080, it delivers very good results as well, even though it loses a bit of performance compared to Windows, with NTSync delivering some stutters with this game at 1440p ultra-wide, because yeah. Cyberpunk 2077 it is now, and we have the 9070 XT performing slightly better on Linux than Windows, but on the other hand it delivers lower 1% lows. While the 5080 does outperform the 9070 XT on Windows, but gets smashed on Linux. And things don't really change at 1440p ultra-wide, where somehow Linux is delivering considerably lower 1% lows, but also considerably higher average FPS on the 9070 XT. I tested this same situation several times and the results were around the same, which is kind of odd, as we're talking about a 29% increase over Windows. And when enabling ray tracing and upscaling, we have the same results as before on the 9070 XT. Higher averages, but very low 1% lows, while the results on the 5080s seem kind of okayish. And going to 1440p ultra-wide makes things even stranger, with a huge performance drop for Linux that was, well, performing better before. I believe that AMD drivers on Linux must be bugged on this game because of the recently released 1.3 patch or something, as the results are, again, very odd. Moving to Robocop Rock City, we have a 1080p the 9070 XT delivering basically the same results on both operative systems, while the 5080 gets a massive FPS decrease, with Linux delivering only 73% of its Windows performance. And at 1440p ultra-wide things get a bit better, I would say, for the 5080 that now delivers 77% of its Windows performance. But the 9070 XT in this game is not only faster than the 5080 on Windows, but also considerably faster on Linux. As for Banishers Ghosts of New Eden, it is one of the games that I tested before, and with all the AMD cards that I tested, Linux performed better in this game in CPU-bound scenarios. I mean, the 9070 XT is also performing better than the 5080 on Windows by a little, but outperforms it on Linux by 20%. And even raising the resolution to 1440p ultra-wide doesn't do much, where the 5080 is now barely able to beat the 9070 XT on Windows, but it is still outperformed on Linux. We do need to state though that the NVIDIA gaming performance on Linux has improved considerably in the past months. Ghost of Tsushima was the first game where I saw the 5080 really performing bad, like bad. While the 9070 XT was delivering very close to Windows performance on Linux, the 5080 was delivering only 66% at 1080p. Results that increased to 75% at 1440p ultra-wide, but are still quite low considering the 9070 XT is delivering the same performance on both Windows and Linux, the way it should always be. And the same kind of happens with The Last of Us Part 2, where both cards lose performance at 1080p, but the drop is much bigger for the 5080, that is 7% faster than the 9070 XT on Windows, but also around 33% slower on Linux using NTSync. And 1440p ultra-wide again doesn't really change the balance. The 5080 is still the fastest card on Windows, as it should, but gets owned on Linux, delivering lower averages, but most importantly, much lower 1% lows. And we have the same scenario with another Sony game, this time Spider-Man 2. At 1080p, in a more CPU bottlenecked scenario, we have Linux barely losing performance on the 9070 XT, but with the 5080 presenting big FPS drops compared to its Windows performance. This, while at 1440p ultra-wide the 9070 XT is faster on Linux with slightly higher averages and 1% lows, with the NVIDIA card losing performance once again. It is what it is, I guess. And Starfield is another bad situation for the 5080. It took NVIDIA and Bethesda some time to make NVIDIA GPUs perform well on this game when running Windows, and it seems that the issues are even worse on Linux, because while the 9070 XT loses performance, which is kind of understandable, the 5080 goes to almost half the performance when running Starfield on Linux. And it doesn't change much at 1440p ultra-wide, where the 5080 is faster than the 9070 XT on Windows, but considerably slower on Linux. On the other hand, Doom the Dark Ages is performing quite well, and while Doom runs natively on Linux, it uses Proton for some kind of ray tracing implementations, I believe, but I might be wrong here. At 1080p, both cards are performing decently well on Linux, with the 5080 now being faster on both operative systems. Something that still applies to 1440p ultra-wide, where both cards perform better on Windows of course, but with the 5080 losing more 1% lows when running Linux when compared to the 9070 XT. But again, generally, the 5080 just runs faster in all scenarios. Oblivion Remake is another no-go for the NVIDIA card here, because it uses Unreal Engine 5, I guess, delivering only 75% of its Windows performance when running Linux, while the 9070 XT also loses performance, but so little that in a real gameplay scenario I believe we wouldn't even notice. And it keeps being that way at 1440p ultra-wide as well, with the 5080 being 14% faster on Windows, but around 10% slower on Linux. This alongside much lower 1% lows, sadly. It really seems that Unreal Engine 5 games have kind of mixed results when it comes to Linux's performance. And speaking of Unreal Engine 5, we have yet another one, Silent Hill 2. And another one where at 1080p the 9070 XT barely loses any FPS, actually delivering higher 1% lows, while the 5080 numbers are just much lower. Although it seems that things get better for the 5080 at 1440p ultra-wide, because even though it loses performance, it at least achieves 60 average FPS, which is still higher than what the 9070 XT delivers. But yeah, I would like to see NVIDIA drivers improving to the point where they match their Windows performance across the board. The Alters is one of my favorite recent games, and it is only being tested at 1080p because the game would simply crash on Linux at 1440p ultra-wide. I don't really know why, but it happened on both the RX 9070 XT and the RTX 5080. But again, this game uses Unreal Engine 5, and again we have the 9070 XT losing a little performance only, while the 5080 gets a big FPS decrease. As we get rid of that godforsaken engine and move to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, we're able to get some very interesting results. At 1080p, the 9070 XT is delivering basically the same performance on Linux and Windows, and the 5080 is still delivering 134 FPS, being a bit slower on Linux of course, but really only by a bit. And the same happens at 1440p ultra-wide, where the 5080 performs exceptionally well on both operative systems, with the same of course applying to the 9070 XT. Getting to the averages, we can see that things improved for Linux, especially on the NVIDIA side. Even though these cards were released like half a year ago, Linux is going well, with the 9070 XT delivering at 1080p 98% of its Windows performance, which in my book is virtually the same, and even the 5080 is able to deliver 84% of its Windows performance. At 1440p ultra-wide, well, the 5080 performs around the same, I would say, losing around 1%, but the 9070 XT now delivers 95% of its Windows performance across 16 games, since the Alters is not included because it is only tested at 1080p, which to be honest is still quite good. And if you think about it, some years ago we would never see such recent cards performing that well on Linux, and maybe with SteamOS coming to desktop users, Linux gets more and more used as the time goes by. And well guys, all good things come to an end, and here we are in the final thoughts or the conclusion. And it is interesting for me to point out one thing. Linux is still kind of a bit more buggy in some scenarios than Windows, while Windows is kind of a bit more buggy than Linux in some others. And there are so many distributions of Linux, there are so many Proton versions of Winux, that's a good one, Winux, of Linux. And yeah, there are so many things that prevent normal users to go or to dive into Linux, because again, there are so many versions, there are so many Proton versions, and Proton is kind of a translation layer that uses Wine as a base, but was improved by Valve. Since Valve now has the SteamOS, they kind of needed to have their own implementation of Wine in order to make games perform better, and this is what happens with Proton. And then there are several kind of sub-branches or several branches of Proton, kind of Proton GE, which is made by Glorious Eggroll, which is also the guy that works at Valve and makes Nobara. And then you also have Proton UMU, which is kind of an extension of Glorious Eggroll's thing. So Glorious Eggroll makes Nobara, he makes Proton G, and he makes Proton UMU, I believe. Then you have Proton EM, you have the Proton for CacheOS. Those are several branches and sub-branches of the translation layer, and in some scenarios, a specific Proton version will make your game work better. So there are many variables, but generally, I would just go, if you're using Nobara, just download Proton G and use the latest version of Proton G in your Nobara system. If you're running CacheOS, just go and download the Proton CacheOS, the latest version, and you should be fine. And by the way, I will benchmark Nobara versus CacheOS as well, in order to see which system performs better in terms of Linux gaming performance. Now going back to our conclusion, to the conclusion of the results, yeah, Windows is still the best performer, being on the 9070 XT or the RTX 5080. Both cards perform quite well, much better than they did when compared to, let's say, some months ago, especially the NVIDIA cards. I compared previously the 4080 Super, and the 4080 Super delivered like 70% of its Windows performance on Nobara, and now the 5080 with the open modules and so on has kind of improved a bit, now delivering 80-something% of its Windows performance at 1440p ultra-wide, which is kind of good if you ask me. I mean, with open modules, NVIDIA drivers are getting better, they're getting more stable. Sometimes you try to go into Linux with an NVIDIA card and you still have some issues, but again, it's getting better. As for the AMD cards, all you have to do is just go, install the system, use your card and forget about it, because again, it just works.
It just works. Everything just works.
And to be honest, there are several things that I prefer to have on Linux, kind of quality of life things that we have or that we don't have yet on Windows compared to Linux, like the fact that the Nobara's driver manager actually works, like the fact that we have a store like Windows Store, but we have lots of applications like VLC, OBS, we have lots of applications that we can download directly, meaning that you don't really need to go to the internet, as you did some years before this. You just needed to go and install some applications or even the drivers via command line, and now you don't really need to do that. You have Nobara's driver manager, you have of course the Linux store for applications, so you're completely fine on that regard. And in terms of general smoothness, of course, because Linux is kind of smoother when working it on the desktop. And if you ask me, of course, I'll tell you that Windows is still my choice for general using, because of there are some software that doesn't work on Linux. Linux tends to get more buggy as soon as you start changing hardware devices, while Windows works that out better. But generally, if you just go install Linux on your system, you'll be completely fine. And there are people that have been using Linux on a daily basis without any kind of issues, especially builds like the CacheOS, builds like Nobara, and again, there will be no issues whatsoever. Linux is just easy to use nowadays, and it's only getting better and better in terms of gaming performance. As for NTSync, I believe that NTSync doesn't really do much here, at least when using Proton. Maybe it can do something when using the regular Wine, something that I also have to test, Wine versus Proton, and several versions of Proton. I guess I need to do that. But it might be placebo effect, but I think that I noticed smaller input latency with NTSync. While the FPS weren't that high or that much higher, in terms of input latency, I felt that in some games the input latency was lower with NTSync when compared to F-Sync. So I guess that's the main thing, or maybe for really older games NTSync might be a game changer, but for recent games NTSync is just better or slightly better in terms of latency. Otherwise, FPS wise, the difference is, again, as you saw, very small. And that's all for today's video, guys. Thank you very much for watching. By the way, I hope that I see you here in the next video. I'm going to go back to my roots and start benchmarking things that people don't. I will start benchmarking more things about Linux. I will start benchmarking things like, for example, I was trying to get some information about FCLK, which is kind of the Infinity Fabric values on your Ryzen CPUs, and I found exactly nothing online. Like, nothing. I don't really know what's happening, but I didn't find any benchmarks for that. So no benchmarks for FCLK 2000 versus 2067 versus 2133, no benchmarks whatsoever. And I was like, why? So I guess I have to do them. And I have some more. I'll be deep diving into RAM once again, RAM frequency benchmarks, timings, and so on. But well, I'll see you there, I guess. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.